speaking of the campaign, I guess first question is like, what do you think happened?
I think that we accomplished tremendous things, and it's being borne out right now. I mean, we genuinely may have changed the course of history with the campaign. But what happened was we were maxing out in terms of energy and enthusiasm and resources and volunteers on the ground in Iowa. And certainly everything leading up to February 3rd, the big question was, how many Iowans were we going to get on board?
Mm-hmm.
And incredibly grateful to everyone who went to Iowa in particular and knocked on doors and volunteered. And because of their efforts and everyone's efforts and all of the resources we put into TV advertising and the rest of it, we were very real in Iowa. We got 5% of the vote. And I remember saying to someone, I need 40,000 Iowans to eradicate poverty. And we got something like 9 or 10,000. And so in a way, it's actually like pretty awesome where we got like 25% of the way to the eradication of poverty. But in electoral reality, if you get 5% of caucus goers in Iowa, you have to be above 15% to be viable in a particular district. And so 5% actually got shrunk to something like 1% of delegates, which then allowed the press to say 1%. And then you were like, well, like that's technically correct. And if you're looking at delegates, but we kind of did better than that. And so there was a lot of energy. And then, of course, Iowa was a fiasco, where like, results weren't really reported in a prompt way, and the chair had to step down and all sorts of like problems. So I think we had like this wave that was cresting, and then it hit Iowa, and then we really had like a significant like pitfall or trouble spot. And then from there wasn't much time to do anything but just get to New Hampshire and then try and build back up. And so to me, everyone knows watching this, like I was on a bus for 17 days in Iowa, just conducting town halls and trying to get in front of people. And when we looked at the voter district data after the fact, we performed much more strongly in places where the bus stopped. So that's good. At least it makes you feel like, well, when you went there, like things got better in that place. But I'll tell you, Tom, I went to a caucus location in West Des Moines the night of February 3rd. And I was like, oh man, this is not going to go well for us. Because you walked in there and it was like, it was not Yang Gang, let's put it that way. There was like this very, very small set of Yang Gang. And then it was like a lot of suburban Des Moines voters who were there for Pete or Elizabeth or Bernie or Joe and like a smattering of Amy. And I was like, woo, like these are not our people at all. And like I gave like a talk, and by the time I gave the talk, then like it was very well received. People were happy to see me, obviously, because having one of the candidates there. But I talked to Evelyn about it too, and Evelyn went to a caucus site in another part of that area, and she was like, "Wow, was the caucus process terrible for Yang Gang?" Because the leader, the district captain in Evelyn's district, was this introverted Asian guy, like college kid. And when it was his turn to speak, like it was clearly like something that he had to really gird himself for. And then that he managed to like get it done. But like there was something where the caucus process actually favors people with like a high degree of extroversion, comfort in like a gym.
Yeah.
So like the caucus process not great for us. But we went straight from there to New Hampshire, and we had like a relatively brief period to try and build back up. Like the reality on the ground in New Hampshire, we ended up performing a little bit worse there than we did in Iowa. And leading into that time, my team was saying, it's like, look, if we don't put up some kind of whopping double-digit number in New Hampshire and get some delegates, it's going to be, a really rough path moving forward. So what they tried to prepare me for was that if we didn't put up some whopping result, like maybe we should consider suspending, which the first time I heard it was very new to me, because I was like, what do you mean? Like, we're going to be at this for weeks or months. And then they managed to convince me that if we didn't put up a massive result in New Hampshire, that everything thereafter was going to end up being like donor money, people's time, people's energy, like that it was going to be not well spent. And I have to say that was a very tough realization, because you're just going full steam ahead, and you feel all this energy behind you.
Yeah.
And then literally something like 5 days later, like the team's sitting you down being like, hey, FYI, if we don't get to here, then like we might need to consider like making this dramatic end. Like so that's what I was hearing maybe like 2 days before New Hampshire voted, which is that if we didn't have a whopping result, that we might have to suspend, or not have to. I mean, everyone was like, "It's up to you," but here are the variables, and this is what we think, and this is what we advise. Frankly, what some of them just said, like, "Look, we advise X if you don't hit Y."
I have a follow-up question on that. Before we go on to it, I do need to say that I'm sure you and I both appreciate that that precinct guy that did his best in that gym. Probably was really tough for him to give that presentation. So I just wanted to clarify. I'm sure you're appreciative of what he did. The guy in Iowa and Evelyn's.
Oh yeah. Like
I
I'm deeply appreciative and felt for him. It's just like I was just like, Evelyn told me the story in part just to say like this process was not
right.
Something that like set us up or our people up for maximal comfort or success. But yeah, of course, I appreciate the heck out of that guy. I mean, I was that guy, I think.
Yeah, no, I can empathize with him as well.
Yeah.
Do you think like if the next time around, if there will be one, and I really hope there will be one, is the learning that like you have to be really strategic about prepping the captains and practice presentations and selection, or what do you think is the learning from Iowa if you had to do it again?
I mean, to be very clear, most everyone who showed up at that gym knew who they were voting for, and it's not like that presentation was gonna all of a sudden like sway.
I'm switching.
It's like you go to the Hollywood script, and it's like the gym. It's like, oh my god, like
that's right.
So that was not the main variable. What I realized the main variable was, and what actually the numbers bore out, was that the folks in Iowa and New Hampshire grew to know me, grew to like me, but they did not feel like they had permission to vote for me as president of the United States. That they didn't have that permission structure because, in many ways, frankly, like the press narrative that had led up did not cast me as a serious contender. And so what we need to do really is not the work that night, but it's the work like months before, years before, actually, in our case, is to set me up as a credible contender for the White House, because it turns out, in terms of people's like opinion of me, like in terms of my having various favorable attributes, I was top of the scale among the candidates for most all of them in terms of like cares about me, like has the right values, has the right policies. Like I was very high on every rating except for does he have the experience to be president of the United States? And on that one, I was very low. And so for many people, they just didn't feel like they had permission to make me commander in chief. And this is a climate or a time when people felt like a lot of trepidation about who they put forward against Trump. Like that, you can still see it, where people were like, we need to make sure and beat Trump, and we can't really take risks with this. nominee. And so what the big threshold I'd have to get to is like all of those suburban voters in West Des Moines would have had to feel like, yeah, Andrew Yang could and should be president for weeks, months leading up. And it's not even necessarily like, ooh, I'm going to vote for him, but that like everyone's completely allowed to vote for Andrew Yang. Like this is not like a, an out there move to vote for Andrew Yang. In terms of, and if you look at it from a startup perspective or a product perspective, you have like the early adopters, which frankly, most all of the Yang Gang essentially are in this context. And then you have early mainstream and like mainstream and then late mainstream. And the truth is that we never quite penetrated the mainstream of voter context and consideration for just that run-of-the-mill Democrat in Iowa or New Hampshire, where they were like, who am I going to vote for? These are all like, fine conventional candidates. I was still kind of like the out there marginal candidate by the time voting kicked off in both Iowa and New Hampshire.
Yeah, I feel you. I guess we struggled to cross the chasm, as they say in technology product adoption, right? And one thing that I guess occurred to a lot of us was like, even when you looked at the data for Bernie versus Biden, there are a lot of people who actually will say, Bernie, I agree with him on more issues, but I'm still going to vote for Biden. I think it's because of this year. It's all about who they think is the most credible against Trump. So it wasn't just you. I think the whole field basically lost to kind of the more safe, what was considered the safe choice.
Yeah, completely.
So
that was talk about the dynamic. And if I were to run again, a lot of what I need to do during this time is become safe, really.
Yeah. And seeing you on CNN a lot makes you more familiar to a lot of people now. So hopefully, maybe someday down the road, that'll come in handy. One thing, question.
And I confess that was part of the calculation. Is like I think if you just see someone and feel comfortable with them, then it becomes like, sure, that person's safe. Like they seem very reasonable.
Yeah. Oh, I know that guy. He's in my living room every couple days. Yeah, he says interesting things. I mean, it's ironic how I'm sure your campaign was fighting tooth and nail to get airtime on CNN, and now they're paying you. It's flipped.
Yeah, it was. I was surprised to get a call from them, and then even when I got a call from them, I was like, well, this would be a nice way to stay public and relevant. So I was surprised, but it is funny.
Yeah, it's crazy world. Let me ask you this question from Verily, who is saying, do you think it would have made a difference if you stayed till South Carolina? I was talking to your man Jermaine Johnson just a few days ago on the Nerds channel, and he was pretty. Of course, every state sort of all head of the state office is optimistic. But I think he felt like there was a good shot for your message in South Carolina. And certainly it's not like anyone other than Biden did well there. Do you ever wonder if you had hung on till South Carolina or through Super Tuesday, you think anything would have been different, or do you think you got out suspended at the optimal time?
So when I was in New Hampshire, I was looking ahead at the map and I was looking at what the polling suggested. And so in Nevada, our best estimate, and we had internal data too, our best estimate was that the polls in Nevada were more or less accurate and that I was somewhere in the mid-single digits. Now, Nevada is also a caucus like Iowa. So if you're not at 15% in a particular district, you get zeroed out. So we thought it was likely to be a situation where I wound up on the upside, let's call it 5 to 7%, but then wound up with like 1% of delegates and then was completely ignored again. Like it would have been like another like Iowa situation. In South Carolina, like the numbers looked very similar. So like if I thought I was going to get delegates in either of those states, I would have stuck around. Because if you get delegates, then at least at that time, then you, and I'd love to have a delegate to the DNC convention, you know, like that would have been great. But it did not look, the numbers were not rosy in the upcoming races. There was nothing I could point to and say, "Ooh, I'm going to win that place," or get above 15% in that place. If I thought I was going to, I would have stayed. But the numbers said that I was going to do similarly in Nevada and South Carolina as I did in Iowa.
We talked a little bit about doing it all over again, what you would do differently, and sort of being more familiar, having more kind of runway for people to get to know you. Are there other things that you sort of will take away with you for future efforts?
Now, I did not realize just how powerful the media was in shaping the narratives of the race. And when I learned over time how it functions, someone said to me that you should have met with more of like the 200 or so DC Beltway journalists and opinion makers beforehand, because when I declared, obviously no one knew who I was. And even throughout the race, most of them still did not actually ever sit down with me. And so there was like a constant, who the heck is this guy dynamic that built up, or actually didn't build up, it was always there. And so if there's one thing I could have done over again that would have enhanced our chances of success, it would have been to spend time with more of those 200 journalists and opinion leaders earlier on. And I frankly still have not sat down with most of them. And so, you know, that would be the groundwork you would lay for another race that I think would be a big difference maker. I actually did not know that those people were as influential and powerful as they are.